Now we're good.
Good evening or good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to today's Town of Scarborough regular scheduled Finance Committee meeting. Today is Tuesday, September 20th, and it is 4 p.m. The first or second item is attendance, and I will just have the attendance show that all committee members are present. We also have Chairman Clucci here to help us with a later agenda item. So thank you, John, for joining us. Item 3 is normally approval of the minutes. We do not have any minutes to approve this evening, which brings us to item 4, which is our discussion items for this afternoon. Item 1 is a financial and fiscal policy review. This is kind of a two-part discussion. The committee has expressed energy around really kind of taking a deep dive into our fiscal policy, kind of going through page by page and seeing, where our strengths are and where maybe there are some areas for improvement in terms of reporting, but also just in terms of what the council would like to see and maybe give staff some additional directions. And so rather than take that deep dive into the financial policy today, the direction that I suggest is that we create a Google spreadsheet similar to what we do during the budget process. And that way we can organize it by page number of the policy, and everyone can kind of just drop their questions into the Google sheet. And that way staff will have them ahead of time. And then we'll plan to have that deep dive discussion at our October Finance Committee meeting, if that works for everyone else. No, not quite.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of the discussion, and it has been a priority of this committee to review the policy for quite some time. So I know it's dry, but I am kind of looking forward to having that discussion.
I think that's a good approach, because some of the questions I have as I read it are just like clarifying questions where I just don't personally understand something. And so having staff have the time to kind of, one, see if they can interpret what my question is, because I might not be asking the right question, but two, just giving them some time to react and think a little bit about questions, because I think there are clearly some areas where we could probably start to think about recommending some enhancements, changes, clarifications. But I think there's some things that before we even go there, we probably need to really make sure we understand either the intent, because I think that's my thing sometimes when I look at this policy, like some things, it's not clear exactly what the intent is. And so is there clarification, or is that what this committee can help to do, is provide better clarity in terms of what the intent is so that it's clear as you read it. I think we actually have one of the most robust fiscal policies out there when I just kind of looked at other towns. The good side is it's pretty robust. The bad side is, like, when I read some of the other ones, I actually understood theirs a little bit more clearly in terms of what they were trying to accomplish. And so I think that's just, for me, like, as I was looking at it, it was like, there's some areas where we could probably simplify some things and make it clear to the public and to the council. Where, again, to me, there's just some question marks.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the other objectives or goals that I would like to see us kind of drive towards would be developing either a rough calendar or some kind of timeline that, we could follow kind of as a script, knowing first quarter every year per policy, the following things need to be presented and discussed at a finance committee meeting. Second quarter, these are the things that we need to tackle, because part of the challenge that we have as elected officials when we change over is, sometimes material gets lost as we shift to a new committee. And so just having a rough outline that keeps us in line with the policy, I think would be really helpful. So
Like a rough calendar.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea.
Okay. Any other comments about fiscal policy for next meeting?
I don't have any questions. I think it's a pretty robust policy. And I know we're always a finance director, which is responsibility of finance director to implement what we see. So we're operating at a deficit. Let's continue on.
Okay. So I'm going to turn the next part, 1A, over to Tom, so that we can discuss our debt ratio reporting.
Sure.
Yeah, and perhaps I should have offered a couple of just contextual comments on the policy itself. Perhaps it's helpful for the committee and the public to appreciate. Prior to this policy, we had 4 or 5 different policies, standalone: a fund balance policy, capital, debt, so on and so forth. A past series of finance committees thought it would be better to consolidate into one, and I think in doing so, made a bit of an unmanageable beast in some respects. And I think I'm probably on record multiple times through those multiple years of discussions about there's a lot here and there's a lot of self-imposed requirements. And I believe you are right. I've heard it from a number of different independent sources that we have arguably the most robust policy. And I think that puts us in good measure with the bond rating agencies. Having said that, we have a policy, we need to follow it.
Mhm.
And so there's kind of danger associated there. You don't have to have a policy, it's recommended, but if you do have one, you darn well should follow it. So I think to your point of making it understandable for current members, for the public, for staff, and achievable, I think is a real important hallmark and something we want to work toward. So that's kind of the quick history, and this didn't happen overnight. It was over 3 or 4 years, as I recall, frankly, through fits and starts, and here we are. So what I thought I'd do, there was obviously a fair amount of attention and discussion really around the library ballot question and kind of the involving, the debt discussion that surrounded that and other capital projects that are in conversation around the requirements of our policy, particularly around as it relates to debt. The other major construct of this fiscal and financial policy is really creating systems and requirements to do some forward look. I think past councils had felt as though they're making decisions kind of blindly and kind of knee jerk with kind of myopic what's in front of them. We need a longer view and really some metrics and some dashboarding to help us kind of understand better where we're going to make some of those longer range financial planning decisions. So that's kind of all the background. But really, to the point, I think a fair criticism has been that we've been remiss in following our policy in terms of actual reporting. And the real approach here is intended to provide some financial and fiscal health measurements, if you will. And there's no magic behind this. There's no rule book. We relied on the GFOA as a source. We looked to our financial advisor, staff had ideas, finance committee members had ideas, and all of those inputs came into what we've put together is a dozen or so different kind of metrics that measure a different thing, but kind of look to give you a picture of fiscal health, if you will. So I did bring Larissa Crockett back to assist me with preparing this. She was the chief architect of kind of putting this together. She was able to kind of update these numbers fairly quickly. So what you have in front of you is a kind of a down and dirty, if you will. We can certainly clean this up and expand it further, but I think it provides the basics to at least begin the conversation, and it hopefully will leave you with some level of comfort. But these are the measures that our fiscal policy indicates. And I should have done a better job of grouping them, but the first 4 are debt limit related. Kind of the middle 5 are directly from the policy. This is Appendix A. There are particular metrics that it calls out. And then the last 4 I'll characterize as more fiscal health measures, kind of, fit in one box. They're partly fund balance related, but not entirely. And so altogether, these are intended to provide a sense of kind of global fiscal health, if you will. You'll see the second column there is what the policy dictates as our goals or standards that we've set for ourselves. And all, there aren't applicable in all cases, but in many of them there are. The first handful of them are more statutory related. And in fact, we've imposed some higher standards than the statute requires on us. And this analysis looks back at the last 3 closed fiscal years, 19, 20, and 21. Those are the most recent. So you'll see for each of those years, we've calculated what the actual metrics are and then compared them to the goal or the limit. And the coloring is a very simple nod at whether something is moving in the right direction or or there's maybe a warning or a watch area that we should be looking at. Certainly nothing's red, which would be a hard stop. The other thing I would say is that none of these in and of themselves should be determinants of any final decision. They're really intended to be, hey, something's going on, let's talk about it. Let's see if we can understand it. Shall we do some sort of correction to get us to a different place, or should we? So it's really intended to be indicators, not kind of final decision making by any stretch.
Do you know, Tom, like when we prepare the budget and the CIP, is this analysis done when the final CIP is proposed by you to say, looking out 5 years, are we still yellow or sorry, green across the board, or is there a check like that?
No, we don't do it certainly on the 5-year look, in part because whereas there's still budgets, even the first year of the 5 years, a budget number. So it's an estimate, but it's an educated guess. For years 2 through 5, those are really placeholders. I mean, there's some education to them. So we could do that, but I don't necessarily put a whole bunch of faith and stock in that. I would say that we comfortably have a fair amount of margin on a lot of those debt indicators. So I don't think what you choose to do in a single capital budget or even a 5-year capital plan is necessarily going to, in and of itself, upset these debt metrics, I suspect. Now, when we start talking about these huge, big dollar item capital items, I think that's a reasonable factor, and the sort of borrowing that's being contemplated, I think, does need to be run through this, and will have a noticeable impact. Debt per capita, for instance, is going to go up considerably, as you might expect.
And that's the part that's like, to me, sometimes a challenge, right? Where I think we want to look ahead, but like even looking at these metrics, the denominator for a lot of them would be a guess, as opposed to knowing for certain. Like, we won't know exactly what our revenues are or what our valuation will be, so we can estimate to forecast out.
I should say, the goal is to kind of get things to start looking ahead, or make longer range capital or financial decisions. But this is really a look back. We're looking back at prior years. That's kind of where where we are. Right. There's a dashboard that we produced that we've not done because it requires a bit more effort. There's a cohort comparison aspect to it. There's also a subjective analysis that myself, the finance director, and actually the finance chair or someone on finance does independent, and then we kind of blend that in. So there's another level of effort that we could do, but it requires some further effort on our part. So I guess there is a supplemental or accompanying narrative analysis that provides a little commentary around some of these points. Liam, I think it follows, or it actually precedes it. Yeah. Probably should have started here. So what was shown on that table is kind of those 3 categories. The first grouping are the debt limit imposed through the policy. The middle 4 bullets are those specific metrics that Appendix A calls out. And those are reported in the table. And the last ones are what I would characterize as fiscal health measurements. Again, it deals with fund balance and some other components. Again, none of these in and of themselves are clear indicators of anything. It's kind of a combination of all of it. And then the second page here is a bit of narrative analysis that goes with it. And I certainly welcome any input. We can spend a few moments and go through that if that helps you. This is certainly my opinion, so it's subject to discussion and criticism as you wish. I just make the point that the pandemic for a couple of fiscal years has created some unique pressures on our budget. And I think that's shown through the years reported here, just worth noting in passing. I do make a point here in the second paragraph that fund balance as a percentage of unrestricted revenues is really the watch area. I think we've talked about that in the past. Our financial advisor made note of that as well. The good news there is that we have very fairly immediate and assured things that are going to change our fortune in that regard. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but you may recall that the Hygges Parkway TIF has been essentially underwater It's not produced sufficient TIF revenues to cover the debt serviced for that. We have, of course, been paying our creditors right along. And there's about a $3 million deficit to the general fund that we've been carrying, kind of plugging that hole through better part of a decade. This year, we will satisfy the final credit enhancement agreement payment in that TIF district. And the council was, I think, very wise in extending the TIF district another 5 years. So beyond starting this year and next year, 100% of all TIF revenues will come back first to pay our deficit. And what's meaningful about that for fund balance purposes is dollar for dollar that will increase our deficit. That's been a drag and reported as a drag since almost the entire time I've been here. Discussion point with the bond rating agencies. So that alone will increase our fund balance position by $3 million or so over the next 2.5 fiscal years. Then we have other performance measures that will affect it positively and negatively. So I really see a bright spot there. It's our watch area, but I think there's a built-in solution that you've already created. Moving kind of quickly through this, really all the debt metrics are trending in the positive direction. By every single one of those measures in Appendix A and report on the table, we're seeing movement in the right direction. So there certainly is capacity, and we're carving out space. Every year that goes by that we don't take on significant debt, we're retiring debt at the same time. The other point worth noting, I think the assessor made a very good point of bringing it to your attention. We had really a banner year when it comes to from a growth perspective. Our tax base grew by $142 million. It amounted to about a 3% growth, which is on the very high end. We're typically between 1 and 1.5%. 3% is really stupendous, and that, not surprisingly, will create some differences when you use that as one of the numerator or denominator in multiple calculations. It's also worth noting that when the state equalizes our value, that 142 becomes closer to 600 million because of the sales analysis they do and the different equalized factors they do to bring that up on an equalized basis. So that certainly has an effect on these numbers as well. And there's just a last commentary around our senior property tax assistance program. We continue to see increasing numbers year over year. We brought this up in this conversation thinking that it might be an indicator of our residents' ability to pay, that more people are eligible because it is means-based. There may be some little truth to that. I think the larger truth is our population is growing, and statistically, if you look at our demographics, we're becoming older year over year. And so all those factors, increased population, older population, more people are eligible for the program. So I think that's probably the single biggest determinant as to why that program, is gaining participants, qualified participants year over year. So I don't know if that's a really good indicator of anything, but certainly worth noting. Very popular program. I can't imagine us ever backing down from that. There's actually been talk about expanding that. And maybe that's not quite so urgent anymore with the state program that provides relief to many of the same folks, presumably. So that's a kind of I guess a quick treatment of a fair amount of data there. But the big takeaway is that, in spite of us not checking in on these factors over the last, 24 months or so, with the exception of fund balance, I think we're in very good shape against at least the limits that we've kind of self-imposed.
So when we met with our partner who gave the presentation, he had suggested that we may want to consider increasing our policy for fund balance to go up higher. I'm just curious, Tom, to get your thoughts on that at this point.
Well, I mean, you can't, I shouldn't say you can't, I think some do, but I would not recommend that we budget for fund balance. Fund balance should be an outcome of performance. And frankly, we seem to be budgeting tighter and tighter to our margins. We don't have a lot of fluff and fat in our budget. And so we're not ending the fiscal year with much year-end surplus. It's that year-end surplus that accumulates over time to build fund balance. That's how it's practically created. Of course, the rating agencies, the financial planners would like your household budget. They would like you to have a certain amount of cash reserves to deal with the unforeseen and the unexpected. And there's a bunch of different opinions about that. Moody's Investments in particular highly values percent of fund balance. And I think what you heard from our advisor is that even our 12% is probably on the low end of what they would look for. There's some communities that have 20 and 25%, which I would argue is too much. That means we're collecting more in taxes than we need to cover our operations. So there's no magic answer there. The other thing, and I'll not give it a proper credit, but we've asked the same financial advisor, what do we gain by that? The good news is we're not sliding in our rating. For us to move to the next rating, it would improve, I think, my recollection is 10 basis points. And that would be quite painful for us and over a long period of time to be able to move, to be able to gain that sort of benefit. So there is something. I'd rather keep focusing on and let's reach our 12% because we're not there yet. And let's stay above that for a while and then we can maybe reset the bar.
I just think like there could be a strategy though, and this is probably more of a conversation if we decide to pursue changing the fund balance target, if that's a conversation the committee wants to have at a later time, would be like kind of how we have in there today, right? If we go above it, we can use those funds for other things. And I think we've tried to establish some reserve accounts in the past, and I think we still have that $1 million target that we're trying to set to have that particular reserve account, which I don't know where we're at right now. But again, I think the idea is that if we meet 12% or go above it, then we can start to put money aside and fund some capital projects through that fund balance, as opposed to needing to tax the taxpayers. But to your point, whatever you're saving is money that could have been used for something else. So there's
there's a real push-pull dynamic, and what has always won in the conversation is tax rate. We need to manage the tax rate I'll say often setting in our artificial target before we even talk about need. And that alone has a chilling effect on our ability to grow fund balance, fund reserves. I've proposed funding reserve through the budget process through appropriation a couple of times. And at the end of the day, keeping a tax rate below a certain number at a certain number is what wins the argument. And so it really requires fiscal discipline, commitment over an extended period of time, because your faces will change and the next finance committee and council may have a different perspective. So it's a cultural thing and it happens over an extended period of time. And Scarborough has a long history of really focusing and managing expectations around tax rate. And I appreciate that, but there are consequences of that, valuing that above others. I guess the other thing I would just say, the other way that communities will build fund balance, again, it comes down to tax rate, is not necessarily budgeting it and appropriating money, but oftentimes communities will, their budgets, they're raising more money than they actually need. So they end in a net positive situation and it builds fairly quickly. The other way, and this is probably the more common way, is to do it through overlay, that the assessor sets I won't say unreasonably, but a higher overlay than they need to cover abatements. And that ends up being in your year-end surplus. Again, when the assessor is ready to set the tax rate, he or she is ever mindful of the tax rate goal set by council. And so that typically blunts any interest or ability to not inflate, but to put in place a larger overlay than is needed to cover the intended purpose of abatements.
I wasn't on the council during the height of COVID and when our fiscal budgets were really being impacted. Was there a point when the municipal budget saw an increase in our fund balance as a result of decreased spending that, things we had budgeted for in the FY20 budget that didn't get spent?
No, not noticeable. I mean, I mentioned COVID in passing just because it's something I'll live with.
Well,
The reality is we fared fairly well. I mean, our revenues did not see take an appreciable hit. There were notable ones, EMS revenues in particular, community services revenues for childcare and programs were hit, particularly in FY 21. But beyond that, you know, excise continued to perform like a juggernaut. Property taxes very, very stable. So when the dust settled, we fared fairly well. A lot of other communities, particularly elsewhere in the country, that relied more on sales and sometimes income tax, far more volatile and affected by changes in the economy, saw huge revenue holes that they're still trying to repair from.
So the actions taken in 2020 to curtail spending, that the money saved by that was actually budgeted in the next year to reduce the tax rate. So there was an impact, but it was immediately spent the next year.
I just wonder, the reason I ask is it makes me wonder whether some communities who have had larger fund balance or communities that carry a larger fund balance, it's entirely possible that they had an incident that can be traced back to a certain fiscal year where they had a building that, you know, they had budgeted to have, you know, however many FTEs and all these things. And then that building or that service was no longer provided. And all of that budget went into fund balance for that year. And so they have that bubble that then they kind of carry. And so I was curious if at any point we had, you know, an appreciable time when we could
I don't
say,
believe
oh, we had
so.
a fund balance bubble as a result of this. And that's probably, you know, and that's partially why our fund balance is what it is.
You know, when we've seen kind of unexpected revenues, there were a couple of years, you may recall, one of the years on the Board of Education, there was some last end of the
Oh, yeah.
year additional money for education.
Yep.
As I recall, you know, rather than throwing it to fund balance or allowing it to go to flow to fund balance, no, you chose to, I think, use half to reduce the tax rate and the other half to fund equipment reserve.
Yep,
So
that's
those are
exactly right.
choices we make.
Yep.
Whereas other communities may have chosen, that's unrealized money or unexpected money. We'll let it simply at the end of the fiscal year, when we close the books, flow to fund balance. But more often than not, communities over literally decades have built this through practices or systems that they have in place.
Intentional.
And it's typically done through the overlay. I mean, when the assessor is making the final decision on, you know, a penny on a $5 billion tax base makes a big difference. So just adding an extra penny can produce additional overlay that is not necessary for the intended purpose, and it will produce fund balance. But again, I'm trying to follow the council's lead and keep that tax base as low as it possibly can be.
So, what question, didn't our fund balance get hit during the 08 financial crisis, so we're actually still recovering from that? Is that correct?
It got hit because the council at the time used fund balance to have a 0% increase on tax rate. So I don't recall the particulars, but I suspect there was fairly typical growth in budget, 3% range in expenses. And the council at the time, hindsight's 2020, chose to use fund balance because we had a fairly healthy position at the time to artificially plug that hole. Unfortunately, that helps you in that year, but then you don't have that $1.5 million in revenue the following year. So that was a fairly unique situation, trying to react to pretty unique recessionary times. It is, and I think at the time I argued that's exactly why you have it, right? You know, these are extraordinary times, and this is a reasonable use. But then to fill that, create that, plug that hole, much less advance it, takes a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, So I welcome, well, I don't really relish you digging back into this. I just know how complicated it can be, but I really do look forward to the day that we have understandable and manageable I won't say reasonable, more reasonable, but understandable policy that everyone can pick up and read and understand.
Mhm. Do you have any thoughts in particular where you see opportunities for improvement? Just in general, or,
Boy, that's a big question.
yeah,
Yeah, I do. I do. And I'll be
Yeah.
pleased to be an active participant in your kind of sharing of thoughts.
I ever thought of maybe hiring an outside technical writer. Because that's all this is. It's confusing is the verbiage.
Mhm.
And like you said, it's a consolidation of multiple policies into a single policy document. So.
Yeah, I think what we could do and should do is maybe bring to you the particular policy decisions we made. I think we spent a lot of time wordsmithing and writing the policy kind of as a committee, and that's really hard to do in the best of times. And it is technical writing.
Mhm.
So I think what we could do is do a better job of really bring to you the specific policy discussions and decisions that need to be made, and then us working them into a cogent policy.
Mhm.
And again, I think we best of intentions, but really created something a bit unmanageable just because of its scope and size.
What I think to Counselor Johnson's point again, like as I read it, there'd be a paragraph where I would reread it and I'm like, so what is this actually saying? And sometimes I felt like it was just filler, not really saying anything. Or again, was there an intent that it said something much more clear that just wasn't jumping out? And again, I think having that type of person be able to walk through it and say, this paragraph, it like the main point that it's trying to make is X. And again, if that's what it's doing, are we accomplishing that? Or do we need to kind of?
It's
simplify it?
important, and if so,
Yeah.
how can we do it so everyone understands what it is?
Yeah, because there were a couple of things. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like narrative that's like helpful narrative, but I don't know if it's like policy. And I think that's where things get a little bit.
Yeah, and
Confusing sometimes.
it's a bit disjointed because, as I said, there were
Mhm.
3, 4, or 5 different standalone policies that we melded into one, and it doesn't flow exactly well.
Mhm.
I'd love, getting a new finance director on board. I'd love them to shepherd all of us through this process, and it'd be great for that to be here during the formative
Yeah.
time and discussion.
I think it's important to clarify, though, that the policy to me it's robust and it's solid. It's some of the verbiage around explaining the policy, because I can read the next article, town manager at finance committee says policy is just unmanageable. No, and that's not the case. It's some of the verbiage makes it a little unclear about the intent, but
Mhm. Can I ask you one question though about it? Because it was like the one that I kept like flagging as I was reading through it. And
Mhm.
again, it just didn't jump out to me. Was what's the difference between the CIP and the capital improvement budget? Because again, I think the policy addresses both of those, and I think we've developed our own language where maybe we use those terms interchangeably, but they mean two very different things.
Mhm.
But that was like the one thing as I was going through it, and I think even for the public, as they review the policy with like what happened recently with the library, I think you could kind of
Mhm.
make your own interpretation depending on which definition you want to use, just based on how it's kind of spread throughout the policy and used in various.
Yeah, the two are
Different ways.
related. The CIP is a capital improvement plan, so we choose to do a 5-year plan.
Mhm.
The capital budget is the first year of that. It's what you actually provide appropriation, well, not in all cases, but review as part of the official proposed budget. And in some cases, make appropriation decisions. In other cases, approve it through the capital budget, and then the voters have to approve it.
Yeah.
Depending on
And that's where I think in the policy, it's a little bit messy between what is the-
changeable. It shouldn't be.
Well,
Well-
I mean, I freely admit, I use CIP to describe our annual budget
Yeah.
all the time.
Mhm.
So.
Yep.
you know.
Well, I just think like as you read it too, I had to keep reminding myself like what it talked about prior. And again, I think there are even like I think in the past year, right, we've learned a few things about how we do things in the CIP, where we've started to establish some consistency around how we're going to capture, especially voter related, referendum related stuff, which I think we haven't been consistent on. So it's things like that that I think even that aren't in our policy today that may be worth just codifying so that it's clear, this is how we do it. Even the question we got in from a resident, which I don't think is in our policy around soft costs and how we build those into a bond. I don't know if I saw your response, Tom, it was a great response. Is that like state statute that allows us to do that? And so we're following state statute, but are we doing it consistently? We're including soft costs. So again, those are the types of things where I think as we dig into it, we can think a little bit about what's missing from what we've
Yeah.
experienced and how do we,
Many of
does it
the,
make sense to build it in?
it occurs to me, many of the questions that had been raised over the last couple of months really relate to final decisions at the time that we're actually doing the bonding.
Mhm.
Many of the things that, were pointed out that we've not done, we actually have, and when time allows, and I think it has in almost every case, I've brought to the full committee, once the council is the one that controls the bonding process. You need to pass a bond order. Then we go to the market, and I brought back the results of our competitive sale and solicited input because there are choices to make.
Mhm.
Do we include soft costs or not? And do we, how long do we want to bond this for as opposed to another project? So those are discussions that I'm pleased to, have many voices and conversation around what's the best choice for us.
Mhm.
And there's no one answer. It will really depend on the time and the circumstance.
Yeah, I think it's such a long journey, right? From the moment something's an idea all the way to we're issuing the bond to fund whatever the final idea is. Like, I think that's the piece in the policy that's, again, a little bit not consistent, where if we could be clear, again, where maybe we don't even talk about, certain things. Like, again, I think there's just opportunity there. And even like, what does it take to get on the CIP? Like, are there specific requirements that we want, especially if it's something over whatever we set in the charter in terms of what needs to go to voters, just to make sure we're consistent going forward of what goes in there. Or again, if you don't meet everything, when do you need to put something in as a placeholder, and how do we classify that? Just thinking of the schools again, where, they weren't quite ready with a number until after the budget. Like, should we have had a policy that said, hey, we know there's something.
We've known for 5 years
Yeah.
that there's a major project coming down
Yeah.
the line. So to answer your question, there should have been something starting as long as 5 years ago or
Yeah.
sooner.
Mhm.
I think the library is a great example of how the systems worked. I mean, they have come consistently through our capital plan. They've sought and received multiple appropriation approvals from the council to fund their ongoing work. They reached the point of kind of conceptual design. And before we spend any more money, we ought to know whether there's the projects, the voters approve it.
Mhm.
So I think that's a good example of kind of methodically, with clear transparency. This is, had been a discussion point and a decision by councils for, I think, 3 years now. And now it's time for the voters to decide.
And if you recall, the community center was on that CIP, because that was actually a directive that came out of our workshop
Mhm.
as a goal to not bring that forward, but to vet the community as a result of the survey.
Right.
So we put it on the cap, set for that reason. It still hasn't gone through.
Right.
Just mentioned about.
Yeah, and that's kind of vaulted itself to the forefront a bit, really, because there may be some opportunities that we want to be able to capitalize on. Maybe not, but with that one, you're right. We do have a placeholder. I think we put $35 million in one of the out years. I don't know if it was 24 or 25. But then there was a specific request to fund some of that initial study work in the current year. And again, that will help inform whether it's enough to actually get us the deliverables to be in a position to go to voters, and you want to go, remains to be seen. But again, I think that's a slightly different way, but it's still following the process.
Yeah. And I think that's again, we're just not consistent, right? Or maybe, and again, maybe we need to be clear to, yeah. Because again, that one, my concern sometimes when we put numbers like that in there, it's 35 today. What if once we do the next step, it's 50, and then people point to that
Fair
35?
enough. And that I don't know for sure, but I think that's exactly why the school was hesitant putting a number in the budget at all. They certainly have been open in talking about it. You've funded multiple study efforts through the years. But I think they were concerned about putting a number in for fear that they didn't know what number to put in.
Mhm.
That's my sense.
Yeah, and so I guess like the policy would need to be something like, again, if we suspect something's coming and we know it's gonna be big, like, do we establish an order of magnitude or something that we just acknowledge and recognize, knowing that the precise number will come later, but at least we're putting in some acknowledgement of
Right.
something between
Right.
20 and 50 million for the community center and something for the schools. Like, I just feel like as we move forward, that would be something good to kind of figure out and establish some sort of standard on for these really big capital improvements.
So Madam Chair, back to item number one that we've gone about. Who's gonna do that? Who's actually gonna build out that one sheet? Start any questions?
Thank you. We had a long discussion on that before this meeting. So were you going by that? So was there a takeaway, somebody to build that out? Because I would think what we're discussing right now would be part of
Something
that,
to put
right?
in there, yeah.
Sure.
So define a policy of, within the policy of how something gets on the set.
Mhm.
So that's different than the Google Sheet that you referenced earlier, which is the existing financial and fiscal policy that you're going to start to work with. This is a separate policy.
Yeah,
I-
well, would it be different or would be just an entry onto the Google
Yeah.
Sheet saying that we
There's
need to
there's a,
expand our
there's a
policy?
component of the existing policy that talks about capital planning. So I think it could be
I
fit
think
into
this
there.
gets dropped into
Yeah.
the existing Google Sheet. And in the absence of Colette, I assume some staff
Sure.
can
Yeah.
create a Google Sheet that we
Oh,
all
okay.
have access to.
I think of it, there's gonna be like different things, right? There's gonna be questions for clarification. And then maybe as you read it, this is how I kind of went through it. I kind of asked my questions and then I was like, some of these are more leading questions because it's making me think about something specific I think is missing. And so again, maybe we put in our questions, but also maybe some future recommendations
discussion
for
points.
discussion. Yeah.
So we'll create that, essentially be a Google Doc of the existing policy that you have shared access to and can provide questions, comments, suggested language.
Mhm. I think it's good.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions about the debt ratio reporting that Tom put together? Okay, moving on to item 2 is debt modeling, specifically tax bill implications. And I accidentally spoiled this at our communications committee meeting and announced it before it was ready for prime time. And so I apologize for putting John on the spot, but John created a debt model that's interactive and he had sent it to me and I didn't know how many of the staff or other committee members had seen it at that time, but I did allude to it at communications committee as a helpful dashboard to kind of put all of the numbers that we've been talking about in one place. And it also, like I said, is interactive. And so you can change the assessed value and make it more relevant to what you're trying to look at as a resident or as a counselor. And so I thought it would be really helpful to have John come and kind of walk us through even just the basics of what it highlights and how to use it. I've played around with it quite a lot, but I don't know how many other people have.
Just to be clear, before John jumps into it, John has a particular skill set that I certainly don't possess and no one on staff. And frankly, I don't, we could afford someone with that skill set. So I'm forever in debt and in awe of his talents. Having said that, John has been very good about reaching out to myself, the assessor, finance director, testing, asking opinions about certain assumptions. And so certainly there's been staff input in kind of the backup to this, but he deserves all the credit for the.
Is that going to be a requirement in your interview process for the finance director? Is that
Can you
correct?
do this?
Yeah.
Some may.
Could you do
Put
that?
this up and then say, what do you think about this?
Or you an actuary? Or have
And,
you
and
been
to,
a-
and to Tom's point, we have John who has these skills and at no point am I trying to, foist John out into the street so that he can be tarred and feathered by people who disagree with his assumptions. Like this is a tool just like anything else. And, you know, John gathers a lot of different people's input in order to arrive at his assumptions. If you disagree with his assumptions, then you can, in some cases, you can change them. So
Just information
this
for
is,
us.
this is the information.
Need to be a certified financial plan.
Right.
to be
Right.
Assisting the town council.
I clean rooms for a living, so I'm not advising the town on this. I think there's been some confusion about how the library will impact your taxes and how our capital plan will impact your taxes. And all this does is try to simplify it. So if you're a taxpayer and you have a home that's worth, let's say, $300,000, you can enter the value, the assessed value or taxable assessed value of your home up here, and the rest of the charts are dynamic. So what it looks like is this year, you're going to pay $4,617 and for taxes. In today's dollars, that's $4,617 because we're talking this year. And if you go to next year, it looks like you're going to pay $4,753 according to the model's assumptions. In today's dollars, that's $4,637. So this is where I think some of the confusion has been is as your tax rate's going up, so isn't the cost of everything. There's inflation that happens. So the increased money that you presumably are able to take in as a worker, just because of inflation, is offset to some extent by increased taxes that you have to pay. So I did a couple of things. This is based off of the last time that I came to the finance committee. There was a model that I walked through everybody that at that time showed a pretty big spike in, I think, 2026 or 7 due to issuing debt for a school. We're starting to. I updated that model. I'm not going to go there yet. So let me walk you through the pie chart. The pie chart, all right, the big blue is everything that goes into your taxes except for debt. And the blue and the little blue is the library, if it's approved. And the big blue is other debt. Okay. So you can look at this in 1,000 different ways, but honing in on the library, it's going to cost this homeowner with a $300,000 home about $1,071 total over the next 30 years. In today's dollars, that's more like $761. I'm going to renormalize because I've done some of this math in my head before to a $400,000 home. There you're more at $1,428 over 30 years, about $1,000 this year. So the average per year in today's dollars is about $35. This assumes we're financing it over 30 years. I also financed a community center over 30 years. I tried to normalize things to be fair or consistent. School's also going over 30 years, but I do incorporate that deferred interest for 5 years. The neat thing that I think where I got down to is our tax rate changes, which is the bar that goes around here. It hardly ever gets above 3%, which I thought was pretty good news. So through modeling, we found a strategy or a way that could keep the tax impact of taking on these major projects within a manageable level. And now also, so this chart is also interactive. So if you want to see specifically what the library is going to cost you, you can click on this and it'll change the chart. So now we're only looking at what you're paying out of your taxes for the library. So in 2025, a $400,000 home will cost you about $57. Jumping ahead to 2040, in that year, it'll cost you about $46.
I have a real simple question, if you don't mind.
Goodness gracious, this. So let's say year one, I think you said $35,
Average over
average over.
30 years in today's.
Now, I can understand that dollar figure fluctuating if the bond rate fluctuated, but it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It's static. So $35 today is still $35 5 years from now. So why is it fluctuating?
So there's a couple things going on. What we
I'm
are,
not counting inflation, my $35 really being $45 5 years from now.
so there's a couple things happening to your $400,000 home. In 5 years, presumably is going to be worth more than 400,000. And we have some assumptions built into the model for how much it's going to go up. So we expect in 2025, it's going to go up substantially, about 25% is the assumption. After that, about 10% every 5 years, maybe a little less than that. So the value of your home is going up. The debt service on that library is staying the same.
Right.
Okay. There's also new taxpayers coming on board that are picking up some of that debt load
Okay,
as time goes on. So the burden to you as a taxpayer today is going down.
it's going down, not up. Okay, right. That makes sense to me.
Okay, good.
So, but I thought I just heard you go from 35 to 47. And that's up, that's not down.
So let me click on the library. Let's see where I was misleading you. So this is the library. So we're not going to issue 13, I'm assuming we're not going to issue $13 million of debt tomorrow because we need to get through permitting and plans before we would take a bigger bite. So I think I'm assuming that we're going to issue about $1 million of debt with this year, in this fiscal year, which really the payments won't happen until next year. Then next year we'll issue the second tranche, which will probably be half the project, somewhere around that, and then the final tranche the following year. So that's why there's a ramp up for the next couple of years, and then it starts to taper down.
Those are the decisions that I will bring and look for guidance on in terms of when we're gonna actually incur the debt.
Now, that makes sense, because we're trying, and you're right, that's the way bonds are. So in that context, that makes sense. But without that context, I can see how it confuses people, confuse that heck out of me, so. Thank you for that.
I think that's been the challenge
Yeah.
when the library is like, wants to know, because they've asked a couple of times, like, what is the impact? It's like, well, it kind of depends on when we're issuing the debt and, you know,
The first year is different.
yeah.
I don't know if people really want to know at that level. They really just want to know what's my impact.
Yeah, and
It sounds to me more like it's
Mhm.
$35.
Well, and I think that's the, that's the question, John, and I don't know if you have a statement that, Tom, you would kind of stamp and say that is the official statement of the town in terms of what is the question and what's the answer, right? Like, that's the hard part, is like, is the question, if you're a $400,000 home, what do you anticipate as your total contribution towards the library over 30 years, which would be $350 or $3,500 or
It's about $1,000.
About $1,000.
yeah.
So there's
so-
a standard usually when you're talking about the cash flow series, you discount things to a common point in time when you're putting out quotes or numbers. So in this case, you could say something like, about 0.5% of your taxes over the next 30 years will go towards supporting the library. I think that's a fair statement. And it just happens because it's small. It's not much different if you don't use the discounting, and it's easier to explain.
Mhm.
So I think the library ought to think about what question they want to ask.
Right.
Well, I think the one I just kind of articulated is kind of, it's kind of hard because I don't think they know the question to ask. They're asking, at least I'm thinking back to our communications meeting. They just want to know for the most basic resident, how to answer and respond to a question that says, what is the impact to my taxes? And again, that's, yeah, and that could be, we need to clarify what
Yeah, I mean,
our response is and what
Yeah.
factors are in that response. I think we have the flexibility. And so I guess the question is what is the most reasonable thing? Like, I like kind of what I said of like, if you're a $400,000 home over 30 years, it's $1,000. Like,
Right.
I think people can get that. I think when we start to get a little bit more detailed, I think that's where the wheels fall off and it gets more complicated. So I guess like, what's the simple way to do this to provide a simple response that the public can
yeah, that's
say,
probably
okay.
the most relatable and easy to understand way of us presenting it. In the past, when I've been asked this, we've simply done it very, very simply and frankly not correctly. We've added $13 million in debt next year. What does it mean to the taxpayer in year one? that doesn't give a true reflection, doesn't consider the time value of money, it doesn't, you know, all the other changes in growth and tax rates and revaluations. That's what this does.
I think my mic's on. And also, I also like getting away from the 3% number. I know, John, you had said, you know, that the line up top that is kind of climbing along stays under 3%, which is good news for taxpayers. But I also kind of think we lean a little too heavily sometimes on our percent number. Because yes, it only rises above 3% for the 1 year. But that's because it gets rolled into next year's budget and then we tack 3% on top of that again, or we go back to our 3% goal. And so I would rather we come up with a simple statement that says what the impact is going to be over the course of the bond if the bond is 30 years. I think that's the most simplistic way
Simple.
we've articulated it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'm ambivalent. I think there's probably enough here where you guys can come up with a statement which would be better than me doing it, because I'm going to try to be more precise than is required for.
Well, I think this is wonderful. This is
Yes.
wonderful for people who really want to get into the nitty gritty. But I feel like for 80% of the community, just being able to
Right.
provide the library that specific statement, which is like a simple, truthful, backed by data that we can say that, Tommy, you would stamp and say you're behind that. I think that's what I feel like we need right now for the library. I think there will be that question of, but what does it mean if you have the library, the school, and the community center, which again, we can do that if we feel like it's necessary to kind of do the same thing. Because what I would imagine is it's just that $400,000 home plus, John, you probably have it in here. Which one of these would be answering over the 30 years? Is it that
For the
14
school?
Yeah, 14,000.
So right now, if you don't click on anything else, it's giving you the sum of every year that's displayed in the chart, which is 31 years. So for the library expansion, the total cost would be 1428. If you want to express that in today's dollars, it's a little over 1,000.
Mhm.
And then I do have the school here and the community center
So
here.
it would be the sum of those three that would give you what the total impact
Mhm.
you as a taxpayer for $400,000 home over 31 years, based on the assumptions that we have here.
Based on the assumptions that are
Mhm.
in the model, which is linked down here at the bottom.
Mhm.
And it looks very similar to what we went over. I did want to call your attention to a few things where you may notice that we're no longer we don't have a spike anymore. We're basically able to manage this within our regular 3% rule. I did a few things that I just wanted to show you to get there.
How do you define a spike, John?
Well, I think before I had it going up at our last meeting, a 7 to 8%
Yeah, that's what I remember.
increase in the taxes as opposed to the typical 3%.
Mhm.
And now it's like 3.5% is the highest. So when I plugged in, when I did the model last time, I assumed 1.5% growth in valuation due to new development each year. I don't think that's a good assumption for what we're experiencing today or what we'll experience next year, because most of that stuff is already in process. So I keyed off of what we did this year, which is, as I recall, around 144 million. I said, we're going to do 90% of that next year, which is consistent with our policy. And then 90% again the year after that. And then I bumped down to 1.5%. So that,
These are the sorts of things that he shared with me that I think are reasonable
Assumptions.
assumptions.
Yeah. So
So-
that makes sense. So for the next 2 years, you're assuming 3% growth,
growth, I don't think it quite gets to
90% of
3%, but
90% of 3%.
yeah, it's
Okay.
tapering down from 3%.
And just to ask, because I think it's important, you tell me if I'm wrong, but the benefits of if we did the community center and the schools and a TIF aren't even considered in this, which would actually make them more favorable to the taxpayer. Is that correct?
So correct. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is going to be some benefit there, including the public safety building that I don't have in here.
Yeah,
Right.
as well.
The key to all that is that we need sufficient TIF revenues to be able to pay. And so just, I don't want to get off topic,
That's-
but there's a financial motivation,
Mhm.
to make sure there's sufficient revenues to enable, using TIF
benefit.
revenues.
Mhm.
Right, and we're teetering on the line of being a minimum receiver or not. So it might bounce back and forth depending on the year, how much the benefit is. But the good news is there isn't too much downside that we can experience. I don't think, because
At the low end, it's 8% savings. At the high end, it's 58% savings. Obviously, I know what I'd like, but
Mhm.
8% is still better than,
either way, it's a
Nothing.
benefit.
Still
Either way, it's a
something.
benefit.
How come we would never go back down to the 3% we were seeing, or the one, was it 1% or 3%? I thought it was lower than 8. Am I misremembering? Maybe I'm thinking of our capture rate.
Closer to 6.
Okay.
I think it may have been 6%. Now,
Like at its
I
lowest.
think it would be close to 10. A lot of it depends on how funding formulas are working.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully the state government continues to fund 51% of
Yeah.
public education. That's a
And
huge
that-
benefit to Scarborough that should not be overlooked.
They don't vote.
Yes.
and for all those reasons, none of that's included here, because I think that starts to add a
Yeah,
huge
that
level of
could change.
conjecture beyond our control.
The second tweak, and I think this is the only other one, is in addition to the realistic assumptions for growth, I actually have us putting money into a capital reserve over the next 4 years. And the model thinks we can afford it, Tom, but we shall see when you go through budget. This,
What your tax rate goal is.
it still stays to 3%. But that's, what I'm gathering is the growth that we've experienced recently, it's created some capacity. So you can still grow your expenses at 4.5%. There's going to be our debt load's coming down no matter what right now over the next 2 years. So I think there's going to be room there. There might be other needs that take precedent, but that's how we're managing the impact right now, is by creating a reserve and then using that to offset debt service in future years.
It's worth noting, this model assumes a 4.5% growth of spending year over year during the entire
Mhm.
period of the model.
Correct.
It also assumes, forgive me, some level of annual capital spending through our capital
About
budget.
13% of the budget.
What's that number annually?
It's not,
Is
it's
it-
not contingent on it, but that's what we track to. It's about 13% of the budget.
Right, but how much annual CIP borrowing? did you
Oh,
include?
4 million,
Was it
sorry,
4?
going up at 4%
And it's
a year.
been below 4 and more than 4, so it's not an unreasonable assumption for this purpose.
So that's something that you can tweak here. I think in the last time we met, I had that at 6 million. So we tapered it down.
Mhm.
Uh,
One thing that I thought I saw it in here. I know for like a community center, as for example, I think the operating costs are relatively high. This model is not including increases in operating costs for,
It's assuming that as these new capital items come on board, you're going to be able to manage them within that 4.5%
Okay.
operating
so that would be,
increase.
that's the assumption there.
And with the community center, we have studied that. I think initially it would operate at a deficit.
Mhm.
But over time, it would cover its operating costs with revenues.
Yeah, there are revenue models.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's true.
Other capital projects, school, obviously, and library to a much, probably not at all. There's really not much revenue potential, but community
Mhm.
center, there is an offset there.
Okay.
That's all I came to say.
That's very good.
This is
It's
awesome.
excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Now,
So-
if we could just get the school on the SIP plan, then I'd feel comfortable talking.
Is
It
there,
ain't there, so.
is there anything
God.
that prohibits us from changing the CIP? Like outside of the budget year?
So the CIP is proposed with the budget by the town manager and the Board of Education. I don't really see any, unless we were trying to do something immediately, I don't see any benefit to trying to change it right now.
Mhm.
But I do think all these things should be considered when we accept the new budget in the spring.
Well, again, and this goes back to this having two different conversations. I think talking about whether or not that needs to go through the budgeting process as part of the capital budget is different than talking about the capital improvement plan.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
I see really no reason to not adjust the capital improvement plan if
Right.
we see a glaring error and something needs to
We
be
should,
added.
Because we're hearing the mantra now of a referendum in 24 on something that's not even on the plan. So
Right. So
So your plan is
versus budget.
always evolving. The budget is determined once a year.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, that's what I
Now,
mean.
but who controls it is the Board of Education and Tom.
Mhm.
It's only published once a year.
And lesson learned, I guess I could and should be more forceful, but I honestly don't see it my role to be changing or directing the Board of Education what they should or should be doing. It's up to them to propose a budget.
Mhm.
And this, I probably was remiss in not being a little more forceful, in at least in that regard, for their own good. But when it comes to their budget request, I'm not providing any influence unless asked, I guess, in terms of what they're asking for. It's their responsibility.
Right.
But this
Which
is where there's a little bit of a conflict because it's our fiscal policy for the CIP. So the question is again, for clarification, library technically, right, is not under.
Well, I think the council has unique and special powers beyond me.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, from my perspective, when it comes to time for budget formation and proposed budget, I typically have a very light touch when it comes to what the school is asking for.
Mhm.
The council has bottom line budget authority.
Mhm.
You can change it however you wish.
We could do that very simple with an action item for the next
Yeah.
plan and say, get school on there, put it in year 5, but at least it's there.
I think they got the memo. I think they understand that it needs to get on.
Mhm.
Well, I'll make certain of that.
But I just want to make sure, because I know the library keeps asking for something that they can communicate, that we can rubber stamp. So
$1,000.
Well, so does anybody have any questions for John or Tom regarding the modeling? John? Of course, welcome.
There's somebody in the
Great to be
audience.
here. Thank you. Just a couple of comments. I think that folks are to be commended for actually getting us on the scoreboard with the town council financial policies, and also some preliminary discussion of fiscal health. I think that is terrific. We're on the scoreboard, okay? So, good news. Take a big, deep breath. Because the more I learn, the more and I'm not typically a worrier, but I'm worrying. I'm worrying a lot. I looked at 30-year fixed rate mortgages, and they've doubled since January. Okay, so the graph goes like this. Okay, the China is running away from, and they're the biggest purchaser of U.S. commercial real estate. They're running away from us. So the old growth engine that our entire model is built on is beginning to sputter. Okay, so all of this discussion we've had about can we, could we, should we, everything looks great. We can do not only the library, we can throw them all in there. We can do it. It makes my heart flutter a little bit, and not out of excitement, out of fear. So I hope that we'll have the opportunity to become more fluent with the terminology that we've just sort of accepted and that we're implementing. And right now, we're still operating in a series of events and crises. We haven't even pinned down the date for which we are going to be reviewing the financial policies periodically. So I think we need a financial calendar. I know we have a great calendar every year. We do the budget process. I think we need that in the least to try to help educate the rest of the council so that we can be better communicators to the public in terms of the questions that they have. The other thing I'd say is that thank goodness for John Clucci. He has this skill and ability to do stuff like those amazing charts that he showed. But we cannot rely on that. We cannot rely on him. John will not be here forever, okay? I mean, he's going to be term limited, or, there will be another composition of counselors, and they very well may have to start at the same place. Hopefully there is some continuity with staff and process. And I think we've done some really good work around predictability about the 3%, no greater than a 3% increase of the 3% in the mill rate each year. But that's a whole system built on growth that now we're beginning to see some very serious storm clouds on the horizon. So I am happy, but I'm worried. And I think we have a lot of work to do between now and the end of the calendar year. And I think it would be great if we could kind of really lock this in terms of a calendar and the meetings that we can run up to so that we're prepared, so that we're not just seeing stuff. I mean, the narrative, for example, in the package today, I mean, it wasn't in the package on Friday, but it's, you know, the narrative page is in there, you know, prior to this meeting. So I, you know, I'm happy on the one hand, but I continue to be concerned. And I attended a budget or a building committee meeting last Thursday of the school, and they are certain, this is the chair of the committee, who is a very impressive guy who has a lot of international experience with real estate, and he's convinced that they will be ready to go to ballot on a vote for a school budget in FY 2023. I mean, next November, not this one, next November 2023. Convinced. I said, well, you talked a lot about two things. One, do you have a partner? And two, do you have the land to build a school? And he said, yes, we do. We're convinced that we'll have that and we'll be ready. So if that really is the case, then I think a lot of our assumptions about the project that's going to the voters in November have not really been fully tested yet. So hopefully we'll get an indication. We'll see what that tells us. But my apologies for letting air out of the balloon. This is all great work. We're further along than we ever have been on many of these things. That is definitely reason to be proud and energized. But we've really only just begun. And the other, I'm still struggling with terms. Okay, the SIP, the 5-year strategic capital plan. There's a capital inventory plan. Okay, is that one plan? Is it 3 plans? Is it 4 plans? I don't know yet. I mean, we're not even clear on the terminology. So, and we rely on the town manager for this. He's got to help us get this locked and loaded. And we've got to get the resources in place to be able to operate so that we're not pulling one another through knotholes over this. The other thing I'd ask for, the model, that'd be great. I'd like that to be made available to the public. Can someone take that now? And can they work it as a member of the public? If someone were to download that, they can go ahead and do that. So I think that's great. It's a great tool that hopefully can be validated, but it's really not fair to John, not fair to the public to require that he be the author and, the person that produces that. It's great a piece of work as it is. So anyway, those are just some preliminary comments. So I know that we're all trying to work on the same thing and trying to get aligned. So I think all of that work is very promising and encouraging, but we need to pace ourselves and we need to start putting markers down in terms of where we need to be by next year at this point. So thanks.
I'm
We're
happy
not
to,
going. I have a model question.
sure.
I thought that's what we were
Sure.
asking. Don't go
I-
there.
No, absolutely. Why don't you go ahead? I'll take your comment now as well.
It's not a comment. It's
Okay.
just a question.
Absolutely.
Debbie Gates, 423 Black Point Road. I just want to clarify. John, did I hear you say the assumption on home values going up is 25% in the next 5 years? We're going to be going up steadily.
So the way we do revaluations, it's not steadily. So we're planning to do one in 2025.
Right.
And as of today, the best estimate from the assessor is that values will go up 25% overall as a town. Individual homes are going to be impacted differently. So in 2025, the model is assuming that values will go up which will be offset by a lower tax rate.
So the assessors, when they do their job, it has nothing to do with the real estate market, basically.
No, it does.
It does.
So as a former realtor in a different part of the country, and I have a lot of friends across the country that are in real estate. 25%, I mean, I'm with Don. I mean, I don't know, I assume you all are reading the same news I am. I don't know how you can sit here and say that.
So you're hitting on why we didn't want to do the reval, or why the assessor isn't recommending doing the revaluation next year.
Yeah, I heard him.
Because we want to allow the market to stabilize and maybe even come down a little. But the fact is, between the last time we did a revaluation
Right.
in 2018 and
I was
19,
Yeah.
and today,
Yeah.
home values are up 30+%. Commercial values are up less than that. So that's why we're coming down to the 25%. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 years, but we're already at that 25%.
Okay, and same on the model, another clarification, when you're talking about figuring out the bond, it's a 30-year bond.
It-
And why is that?
But that's just the assumption. It's something that any user can go in and tweak if they choose.
No. Why would the town, why doesn't it cost more to do a bond over 30 years than having a shorter bond?
No.
Why would you spend more money other than to make it look cheaper to the taxpayers, but you're paying?
It has to do with the time value of money. So the fact is, you may be able to issue debt over 30 years at a
Yeah, I
lower
heard the
rate
time
than
value
debt at
Explanation.
10 or 15 years.
Okay.
So not always.
And one last question. I thought Ken asked about, couldn't we get some outside financial help? And did I understand you, Tom, saying we can't really afford that? Or did I mishear that?
Didn't hear the question. I certainly didn't provide that response.
I mentioned a technical writer.
Technical writer for the financial
Policy.
For the
policy.
policy to make it more easily
And is that
understood.
what you were responding to when you said I don't,
I
or
think
did
you
I
would-
miss it?
I think you were referencing how we were lucky to have John, because if we were to do this
Because
with
if
an
we-
outside party, it would have been a pretty penny. And that wasn't something we had budgeted for, to have that type of,
And nor do I expect necessarily that we'll have internal staff expertise that's capable of providing that level. It would be wonderful, and perhaps I'll be proven wrong, but that was my point.
Right, not that we couldn't afford it, but that we hadn't budgeted for it. And so to have some of the reporting that John has done.
And does that fall into the same category as we don't have a financial person and we just haven't budgeted to be able to have some interim help?
No, I think you're conflating a number of different things. No, I think what's being presented here may well be within the skill set of a new finance director. It would be, my impression is that will be fairly unique, that someone has all the abilities I need on the accounting and financial director side, and these sorts of analytical abilities. I don't think I can afford someone that has that skill set, frankly.
So forget rewriting the policy, the technical writing
Mhm.
part. Just what a normal financial planner would be doing, which I'm assuming is what Mr. Clucci's doing.
No, this is a high level, very sophisticated, this is,
So if we had a financial planner, Mr. Clucci would still be doing this for the
if
town.
it's a need of the town, we would likely have to go out and hire other assistants. We happen to have someone who's volunteered their time. And it's in response to interest on the part of many in the public around modeling a number of these conversation points. And that's what spawned this discussion.
Okay, I didn't understand. I always thought we were in this position because we didn't have a
No,
financial
Can
planner.
I just follow up? Just
Yeah.
More of a question for Tom, like, have you, and this is probably a question when the new finance director comes on board, because I think this is kind of the question that we're getting is like, do we have a skill gap and an opportunity in the future to fund a financial analytics division or expert in the finance department that can do this type of analytical work that I think John's displayed is awesome and helpful. It's just not something that,
I can't imagine that we would be wise to invest a 40-hour position with someone with the requisite skill set. I don't think, if we have a need, I think
More
there are folks we can contract with.
Yeah.
But I just can't imagine a town of our size and sophistication needs someone of that skill level full-time on staff.
being able to
I'm sure
recruit for
for
it might
fee,
be a
John,
challenge.
In my comments around having a finance director that comes with all that is necessary to do the finance director job and this, I simply can't afford that person. And I think you'd laugh at me if I came to you and asked for the budget to support a person at that skill level.
Mhm.
So I wanted to end the meeting by kind of recapping the conversation that we had around the library FAQ at the communications subcommittee. Yeah, Mr. Gates, would you like to speak now? I can still take public comment at the end. Okay. And so kind of just to bring everybody onto the same page with the conversation that we had with like I said, at communications committee, Nancy did come to the meeting. She brought the materials that the library has already prepared as part of their FAQ. And she kind of took input from us. So if you don't mind, John, because since you are the liaison to the library and the communications chair, if you kind of want to just summarize where we are with an FAQ or where they are and what further assistance they need from either the town or at
Yeah.
the
think-
committee level.
I think at this point, they have the information that they want to use to go to the public to talk about, you know, the history and all of the things. But again, they can provide the council if we get questions. I think I shared it with everybody so that we have it. But it's a living document, and the one thing that they still feel like is a gap that they want to include in there is answering the question, which again is kind of broad of like, what does this impact mean to my bottom line as a taxpayer? Right? Which again, even in the conversation, I think we started talking about some of the stuff we talked about here, which is, well, it depends on how you ask that question, what the answer is. And so again, I think they just need help saying, here is the question you should be asking and the answer that we're providing that answers that question. Or even if the question is a general, what's the impact to my bottom line as a taxpayer? The answer is our assumption for a $400,000 home based on the model with a link to this site
Mhm.
is $1,000 over 30 years. I think that's acceptable. I think they're just looking for something specifically. They asked that they want to make sure it's something that the town stamps and says this is the approved town position on this. Because I think they know there's been conversation about like, what's the true number? What's the official number? And I think it's the town who can provide the official number, and they want to make sure that whatever comes forward is at least blessed by the town, that this is our best estimate at this time.
I'll work directly with library staff to provide what they need in that regard.
I appreciate it, especially considering I field a lot of questions and I just want to make sure that people are being directed to the right numbers and to the numbers that are being endorsed by the town. And as well as making sure that they know that the general library questions should go to the library.
Question.
Yeah, Ken.
Where will this FAQ reside?
Right now it resides on a designated spot on the library's website. But we talked about a communication strategy with Allison for making sure that that FAQ is widely available,
Yeah. On
you
our
know, through
website?
social media and on our website. I will open it up to public comment.
Hi, Marvin Gates, 423 Black Point Road, Scarborough. I have a question for the Scarborough Finance Committee about the financial and fiscal policy as it was described in a statement, and I'm going to interrupt myself here. I've prepared this and would be pleased to hand it to you. It's a simple question, might take me a minute or two. I completely understand. Parenthetically, I have the authors of the financial statement, at least the representatives of the authors currently. I have the author of the council corner here that I'm going to be quoting, and I do all of this with the utmost respect. I'll start again. I have a question for the Scarborough Finance Committee about the financial and fiscal policy as it was described in a statement in the council corner, Your Taxes, Your Values, by John Clucci, Chair of the Town Council. This council corner was posted to the town's website on August 31st, 2022, and published in the Scarborough Leader on September 9, 2022. Its paragraph 5 begins, "A large portion of your tax dollars are used to fund capital equipment and improvements." It continues, quote, "In fact, we try to manage the debt associated with these investments to be near 13% of the prior year operating budget, which allows us to smooth the impact of large projects on any individual tax year," end quote. And it concludes, quote, "The capital improvement program that was proposed during last year's budget cycle and subsequently approved by the town council after a robust public process will allow us to easily meet the 3% or lower policy objective and stay within the 13% debt service target. The plan that was proposed and approved, however, did not include a new consolidated primary school." End quote. Yet, in the town of Scarborough financial and fiscal policy definitions on page 23, page 28 of the PDF, capital improvement program, in quotes, is defined as follows, quote, "Capital improvement program, a listing of the planned capital improvement projects coupled with expected costs and financing plans of each for the upcoming 5-year period and scheduled according to priorities and timing, the CIP. The CIP should be organized between capital projects and capital equipment. In addition to estimated costs, a narrative description of each capital item should be provided," end quote. Therefore, does the omission of the consolidated primary school in the current approved capital improvement program recognize that, quote, "a new consolidated primary school," end quote, "will not be a, quote, planned capital improvement project for the upcoming 5-year period," end quote. And if not, why did the, quote, "the plan that was proposed and approved not include a new consolidated primary school," end quote. Thank you. And if it's okay, here's the question. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And I'm not looking for an answer currently. I would love an answer at an appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Is there anyone online wishing to make public comment? No, and I'm not seeing anyone else in the room. At this point, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All in favor? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.